Hello, everyone, and welcome to the High Impact Practices in Teaching podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Palmquist, Professor of Physics and Science and Mathematics Education at Central Washington University. In this podcast, we'll highlight some of the great work being done by CWU faculty, students, and staff. In this episode, we'll focus on the high impact practice of student internships, especially teaching internships. Our guest today has been a science and math education professor at CWU for over 9 years and chair of the department for 2 years. She recently returned from a sabbatical in South Africa, presenting at many conferences and collaborating with many faculty and teachers there. Earlier in her career, she spent a year as a traveling teacher in Bhutan, Egypt, Galapagos Islands, Nepal, and Vietnam. Did I forget any?
There were a few others, but I didn't feel like we needed an exhaustive itinerary.
She does research on how high leverage teaching practices impact learning. I'd like to welcome Dr. Allyson Rogan-Klyve to the studio.
Thanks so much for having me today.
All right, so now this is when all those places are going to be important.
Okay.
You told me that you had 3 college degrees in 3 different time zones.
Yes.
So what's up with the half-hour time zones? Why do some places have half-hour time zones?
I think they're just trying to be difficult. I think they would probably tell you it helps them match the sunrise, sunset to their local time, and they can do that more fine-tuned on the half hour, but it's just obnoxious.
Did any of your places have the half-hour time zones?
No, I've never had a half hour. I've seen on the map there's even 15-minute time zones, which just seems to be really pushing the envelope. I think down to the hours is as much precision as we need.
You were close to one in Bhutan because India is a half-hour time zone.
Yes, yep.
So you just got back from South Africa, a little bit off the topic of internships, but we want to know more about you and your experiences. In what ways does education in South Africa differ from the United States?
That's a really good question. It was a fascinating time being in South Africa, and I actually got to be involved in the education system from a variety of perspectives. I was at Rhodes University in their education department, so I was working with faculty and supervising practicum students in different schools in South Africa. But I also took my 7th grade daughter with me, so I was also the parent of a child in the South African school system, so that I feel like that gave me a different perspective as well. Some things are quite similar. School days are structured pretty similarly. Go from about 7:30 in the morning to 3 till early afternoon. It's a pretty standard day. Some of the subjects are quite similar. Math, science, social studies. Most of the schools have a few more subjects, such as financial literacy and sort of life skills type lessons. I think when I'm reflecting on the system as a whole, one of the biggest differences are sort of the structural inequities that are built into the system that are left over from the apartheid era. So South Africa has some really famous, really fancy private schools that are on acres and acres of land and have their own swimming pools and lots of buildings and are residential and are just I can't really think of anything comparable here. Some of the traditional boarding schools in the East Coast might become similar. So there's these very elite private schools that exist all the way down to some schools in the more rural areas or the areas that used to be called the townships during the apartheid where black folks were required to live. And some of those schools lack electricity. There's not always indoor plumbing. Sadly, children are lost either trying to get to school because there's not safe roads, or they have to do river crossings, or without the lack of indoor plumbing, a lot of young learners, unfortunately, fall into latrines and die. So you have this enormous sort of gap in our spectrum across the education system, from these very elite schools to schools that really aren't meeting children's needs. And it's something the country is still grappling with, not just in the education system, but in society as well, when not that many decades ago, the whole system was set up to prioritize one group of people and funnel all the wealth there at the expense of a larger group of people. So it was eye-opening.
In what ways did it open your daughter's eyes?
The first thing she noticed was single-gender schools are still pretty common in South Africa. So she was at an all-girls school, which for middle school she didn't mind too much. She thought that was fun. I think it was interesting for her. So she was kind of in the middle of the road school. I didn't think she'd be particularly comfortable at one of the very elite schools. We weren't living in a township area, so we weren't near a really struggling school either. So she was kind of in the middle of the road school. And so it's about 90% black South Africans and about 10% white South Africans. And I think it was really interesting for her to hear some of the girls' different perspectives and sort of their family life and their hobbies. In some ways, there's some universals about childhood, and she loved playing on the playground and hanging out with the kids, but also just realizing pretty different opportunities that she has, pretty different family structures and some of that. One of the amazing things about, one of the many amazing things about South Africa is they have 12 official languages. And so a lot of people are tri and quadlingual. Being monolingual there is just really not an option. She had to learn one of the African languages while she was there. And the area that we were in is one of the click languages. So she got to practice working on her clicks and learning some of the click languages. And the girls were so good about taking her in and helping her with that and really enjoyed coaching her along. So I think it was kind of eye-opening to her, whereas it's not incredibly unusual in the United States to be fairly monolingual, to be with peers that speak 3, 4, sometimes 5 languages. I think helped her realize the importance of becoming more linguistically diverse.
Has she chosen to study another language now here when she's back in Ellensburg?
Yeah, she's very interested in sign language, so that's been her second language so far.
Excellent. So our topic today is internships. Just off the cuff, what does the word internship mean to you in terms of students?
Yeah, so I think of an internship as an opportunity to learn how to do something, usually something sort of in the professional realm, and you're sort of learning by doing in a developmentally appropriate way. I think of connections to what used to be apprenticeship models. Earlier in our education system and country history, it was pretty common to do apprenticeships, particularly in the crafts, where you would obviously need some knowledge, but a lot of the way that you learn or become a person in that profession is by doing an internship. So having a mentor or master crafter helping you learn that particular craft or profession.
In what ways would you call it a high-impact practice?
I think with a lot of professions and skills and human activities, again, not in any way to look down on some of the theoretical knowledge. One of my education professor's favorite saying was, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. So having some of that theoretical content knowledge is always incredibly important. But there's a lot of human activity that we sort of learn by doing. Linked to sort of the scholarly idea that I work with some about human practice. And so not practice as in going to basketball practice, but as in like a medical practice. So it's sort of it's the community's body of knowledge that's then embodied and passed on and sort of enculturated in each new generation of practitioner. And so internships, I think, are a key way in which we can share that embodied knowledge and give students, again, developmentally appropriate opportunities to take on more and more responsibility of one of those practitioners.
The American Association of Colleges and Universities, they have their description of that, and they say that the goal of internships is to provide students with direct experience in a work setting and to give them the benefit of supervision and coaching from professionals in the field. Would you agree with that? Anything you'd want to add?
I think that hits some really important points. At least in the work that I do, the other pieces I would add, as I've mentioned already, is it needs to be developmentally appropriate. I think there's sort of levels of interning. I'm mainly obviously thinking from the education perspective, but I think our students can have meaningful internships at multiple points as they're becoming ready to be teachers. But I wouldn't take a person that's never been in front of children before and ask them to do the type of internship that we ask our students to do in their last quarter of student teaching. We do have internship experiences and practical experiences for them, but they're kind of stepping through different processes and slowly increasing the complexity in what they're able to do within that internship. And I think a well-thought-out internship keeps that trajectory in mind.
So it sounds like if you added something, it would be about the appropriateness of the level, and keeping in mind matching where the student is to the job that they're going to do in their internship. Yeah,
and that there's a progression. So hopefully you're going from where the student is to being able to be a fully skilled independent practitioner. but that there should be steps along the way.
Teach STEM has a lot of different types of internships. We'll talk about all those. But just in general, describe the Teach STEM program at Central Washington University.
Yeah, so Teach STEM program is Central Washington University's certification program for any of our students that want to become middle or high school math, science, or computer science teachers. It's based off of what's called the UTeach model, which is a model of math and science teacher preparation that started at the University of Texas, Austin about 25 years ago, and then has been replicated at about 40 different universities across the country. And Central's the only one in the Pacific Northwest to have this model of teacher preparation. Some of the unique features are it's really designed with the needs of math and science majors in mind. A lot of those majors tend to be fairly large plan majors, and so sometimes it's hard for our math and science interested students to explore additional interests such as education or teaching. And so the Teach STEM program is designed to complement the math and science degree that they're already doing. It's also, I think, a really neat feature is we tend to have students in cohorts, so they are taking classes with a similar group of peers all the way through the program. And so they develop some pretty tight connections and collaborations, and I think that really helps them both as they move through the program, but then as they also move into the teaching profession, they already have a pretty solid network of folks that they can connect with. More relevant to this conversation, another key feature from the UTeach model is what they call early and often field experiences. So in education, internship is a very appropriate term to use. You hear terms more like field experience or clinical practice, but that's when we're talking about basically internships, having students out in the classrooms starting to develop and do the work of teachers. And so we have those experiences built from their very first class, and then they continue to take on more responsibility till the last class that they take as student teaching, where they'll take over an entire classroom for a quarter. And then a key part of that is having strong mentorship. And we rely very heavily on our practicing teachers out in the field, but we're also lucky to have clinical faculty in the program. And so those are faculty members that have a lot of experience teaching themselves, and then they're mentoring and supporting our students from the very first field experience all the way through student teaching.
When I first saw the term internship, what came to mind to me was things like working at a business, working in an accounting firm, doing some coding, working with a mentor that way. But then the definition that I read to you fits student teaching and those sort of activities really, really well.
Yeah, very much so.
In fact, probably better than a lot of what we would think of as internships, because a lot of that is going and maybe doing some lower level tasks, but not really doing what the accountant does, for example. But the students in Teach STEM do what the teacher does at the developmentally appropriate level for the intern.
And I think some programs do call their student teachers or students out in the field interns. So you do hear that language sometimes, but for whatever reason, education, I think, more commonly uses the term field experience. But I agree with you. It's very much meets the definition of an internship.
I wonder if we should work to change that, if that would somehow, I don't know what the proper term is, but maybe elevate the experience more, because student teaching, first off, it's confusing because it has the word student and teaching in it.
Which seem like opposites in some ways.
Right. And then it seems like something lesser, right? But internship it's a separate label.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the importance of the flow. You don't want students their very first day to go in and take over a class, but you don't want students near the end to just be doing smaller scale things, working with a student one-on-one only, although doing that is important. So talk a little bit about the flow from the first class. What do students do in those first classes in the program? What do they do in those middle classes and the last classes before student teaching? And if you want to talk about student teaching, or internship, capstone internship,
there you
go. Just talk about that.
Yeah, so our very first class students are, and this is sometimes confusing to our students that have already told us they want to teach middle and high school. The very first thing we have them do is teach a couple elementary school lessons. And that's very intentional to start at the elementary level. First of all, students typically take the first class in the Teach STEM program pretty early in their content major. So we don't have to worry about any content knowledge, and all of our students are excellent with elementary content. We don't have to worry about any content issues. Second, elementary students tend to be a little bit more effusive about their appreciation. So when our students show up at the elementary schools with an interesting STEM lesson, we get lots of high fives and hugs and birthday party invites. That just would be a very different experience at the high school, where you can't be cool and show appreciation, apparently. So the elementaries, starting at the elementary school is a very intentional choice. It also helps our students understand student development a little bit better. They kind of see what types of content is covered at elementary and middle and high school, so they start to see the school as a system, and they can see how their students are going to move through that system. We have students teach in groups at first, so they're not feeling singled out and up in the classroom leading a group of children by themselves for the very first time. They always have some classmates with them. The first lesson that they do is prepared for them. So our clinical faculty members have written the lesson. Our interns, I'm going to call them, take up that language. Our interns have already experienced the lesson themselves as students. Our clinical faculty have taught them that lesson. And then they've also had a chance to practice teaching that lesson here at Central with their peers before they try it out on live children. That's some of the scaffolds that we provide at the beginning. We set the lesson, they're in groups, and they practice it extensively. Then as we move through the program, we start to remove some of those scaffolds. So we would still perhaps pick the topic, and they're still in groups, but there's larger amounts of the lesson that they're responsible for, and they have a larger variety of selection of activity that they need to do. And so those scaffolds are kind of slowly removed to the introductory courses. In the middle of our program, we have them, we're down, still teaching with a partner, but we're away from groups now. So we're down to teaching either by yourself or with a partner. And we have sort of longer teaching days. The initial lessons are pretty much just a single lesson taught to a class of fourth graders. So we have some great partnerships with some of our local schools. Quincy and Walook have always been very good to us. And twice in a quarter, we'll just take over their entire science and math department for a Friday. And then our students teach multiple periods of the same lesson. And we call that our teach-reteach cycle. So they have an opportunity to teach the lesson. They'll quickly get some feedback from a faculty member and or the mentor teacher in the classroom. They'll make that change, teach that lesson again, see if that change worked, see what they want to change next time, teach it again, and do that through 3 or 4 different cycles. So they're getting opportunity to be slightly more independent. They contact the mentor teacher to get the topic, but they are in charge of designing the lesson. They still have opportunities to practice it at Central before they take it on the road. They're with a partner instead of a group, and they have opportunities to make changes sort of on the fly and learn how those changes impact student learning. So that's sort of the middle of our program. In the last year of the program, we put students in a long-term placement. So across 2 quarters, they're in the same classroom, and they're going into that classroom weekly and starting to get to know the flow of a school year and get to see how units of study unfold over time. They also do some independent teaching during that last year. In the first quarter, they teach 2 lessons by themselves. They're fully designing them. They're independently in control of them, and they're delivering them by themselves, usually for a whole day. And then right before student teaching, they teach a 3-day mini unit. Up to that point, most of the lessons have been 1-day things. So if something didn't work, it was the mentor teacher's job to fix it the next day. But when you start teaching day after day, if you didn't get where you wanted to by the end of day 1, that evening you get to do a little thinking and revamping, and then coming up with what you need to do on day 2 to get back on track, and then hopefully still get to your goal at the end of day 3. And so by the time students get to student teaching, they have had a lot of opportunities to develop their own lesson plans, put multiple days of lessons together, and usually do pretty well in student teaching or intern teaching. Some of our students stay with that same teacher that they've been with all year. Some head to other school districts. But for 10 weeks, they're pretty much in control of the classroom. Usually there's a small ramping up period where they take on more and more classes. And then usually for 5 or 6 weeks, they are independently teaching all day, every day. And then towards the end of the quarter, they start to hand control back over to their mentor teacher. But they are very much the teacher doing all the teacher things during that intern experience.
So you mentioned ramping up with the student teaching, or our new word, the capstone internship.
Yes.
It seems like, though, the students who have spent a year or other quarters in that classroom and have done other teaching opportunities, have had other teaching opportunities, don't need as much of a ramp up. So how much does doing those early experiences help them in student teaching, just aside from the skills they learn, but just how quickly they get into it?
Yeah, particularly with our students that have been in the classroom all year, a lot of them just take over on day one because they've been there so much. They know the routines, they know the students, they're ready to go. And that can be really an advantage because they get more opportunities to teach while still supported and just get a longer teaching experience. But even our students, I think, that for a variety of reasons need to go to other districts farther away from Ellensburg, I think they still find they're usually ready to go. Always going into a new school, there's things to figure out, some basic things like even where's the bathroom and what's the copy code and all of that. So there's still some time to just kind of transition into the school. But I think from a teaching perspective, most of our students report feeling that they are ready to teach and take over.
I know it takes a village to raise a teacher. I've heard you mention clinical faculty. You've mentioned mentor teachers of the non-clinical faculty. You can maybe talk about that differentiation. What are some other roles, other people that play an important part in the program? Department secretary, people outside the department. Who all is part of the village, and maybe define their roles?
Yeah, I think that's really an important point. Education is a community-based activity, and it's important to recognize those different roles. You hit on some major ones there. I always feel like I need to give the first shout out to our mentor teachers. So those are the classroom teachers that are willing to open up their classroom and let our interns work in there. Our interns do a great job, but they are learning. And so they have someone in there that may not know all the things yet. And so that's generous of them to let our interns have those learning opportunities and sort of guide them through that process. The other key players that you mentioned already, the clinical faculty, as I mentioned, are our faculty. They're non-tenure track faculty, if you want a university classification, but they have lots of classroom teaching experience, and they're tasked primarily with supporting in the field experiences. We have our regular faculty in the department that teach the courses and also do some of the supervision. And then we have lots of other key players. Building administration in the schools that we work in play a huge role by creating a culture that is focused on teaching and learning and willing to share their knowledge of teaching with the next generation of teachers. We have HR in the districts that play a role, that do all the paperwork and make sure our students are ready to go and legally entered into their school district. We have a lot of folks on campus that play a role as well. We have the Office of Field Experiences in the School of Ed that supports us. Again, to become certified, there's an external agency that does that. In Washington State, that's the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, or OSPI. So they help us stay on track with OSPI with all the documentation and accreditation that we need. We have a program specialist in our department as well that supports with all sorts of things related to our internships. We're fortunate to be able to provide a little bit of financial support to our students that travel for their internships. She helps them submit those reimbursements. STEM teaching is often, hopefully, equipment intensive because we want the students to actually be doing activities with our interns. And so she runs the equipment loan program that makes all those educational materials available. One thing we haven't mentioned about the Teach STEM program is we have something called the internship program, which for this conversation makes it sound confusing. So we're able to offer sort of paid additional learning opportunities to students that would like that as their job. And so that brings us into the community even further and creates sort of more of that community feel and that sort of wraparound ecosystem for education. And so our interns are students that apply for positions and then help in different or work in different STEM education related opportunities. So we have some interns that do a lot with robotics teams in our valley, that work with Math Circle, that do some tutoring at some of the local schools, that do a lot of planetarium shows for folks here on campus, and they also do the portable planetarium, so they're on the road with the planetarium sometimes. And so our program specialist, Corey, runs that internship part of our program as well. And I'm sure there's people I'm leaving off, but it is definitely a community village effort to have an effective teacher preparation program.
Later, I'll ask about bigger funding sources, but you mentioned the paid internship program.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the university doesn't have a lot of money for student help. How is that financed?
Recently, we went to the UTeach conference and shared about this internship, what we call the internship aspect of our program. And that was an important question because it does require some funding sources. So there's a few sources that we use. One is through grants. So either grants that we write directly to support interns, or on some grants, there's a source of funding called indirects. And that's sort of money that's given by the granting agency to the university to use at their discretion, because people that are doing the grant work are using university buildings and things like that. So it's meant to offset those costs. So we use grants those two ways. Another way that we try to support internships is through private endowments. So we've had some very generous families that want to support STEM education in our community and have made donations. The Wright family has been very supportive of the program, and so we're able to use their donations. The Anderson family is another family that's been really generous. And so those are probably the two biggest fund raising sources. One thing that's nice is our interns are employed through Central. So if any of our interns are work study eligible, we do get a small amount of money from the federal government to help pay our interns. But it can be challenging, but it's something that we find valuable. So it's something that we continue to prioritize and look for the grant money and the endowments to support that work.
You mentioned you presented at UTeach, the national conference, about our paid intern program. Mm-hmm. What sort of feedback did you get from those folks in terms of maybe ways to improve the program or just pats on the back? What were the comments they made?
Yeah, it was a really great experience. First of all, we got to take two of our student interns, and I'll just give a shout out to Jack and Asacia. And they actually did most of the session. It was an hour-long session that we were invited to give. And I think I went to quite a few other sessions while I was there, and I think that was the only student-led one. So I think that was very commendable work that they did doing that presentation. Overall, people were well received. Some of the positive feedback we got was about the way that we're able to form community partnerships. And so there were some questions about how to best form those community partnerships and keep them going so that there are learning opportunities and paid opportunities for our students. There was also just some suggestions around helping support students with sort of work-life balance. It can be a lot to be working and doing an internship in a school and doing this paid internship. So sort of helping students think about all those roles that they play and ways to sort of balance those aspects of their lives.
So you said the audience asked about building partnerships in the community. How do we do that? How does the Teach STEM department do that?
Yeah, there's a number of strategies. When we first started the internship program, we started sort of small and local. So we didn't hire, I think we only had 2 or 3 interns at first, and then we looked for opportunities sort of very close to home. So we had them TAing in some of our Teach STEM classes and then some of the content classes as well. Sort of the second strategy then was to look for existing opportunities that we had connections to. So the Central's math department runs something called Math Circles, which is sort of an opportunity to bring young folks together to do math and have fun doing it at the same time. And so there were some established math circles already on campus. So we had our students work with those. The planetarium was one that an opportunity that we had locally. And then faculty have some connections as well. One of our first clinical faculty member, Arthur, was involved in the robotics community. And so he got us sort of connected with the robotics community. And again, I think it was just 1 or 2 interns at the beginning. And now we have pretty much all of our interns do something with robotics. So we have 10 or 11 interns supporting, there's robotics programs at 3 of the elementary schools and the middle school. So we have 4 robotics teams that our interns coach and mentor, and then they help run the tournaments as well. And this year, their involvement has grown to the level where the state organizer has shown their appreciation to our interns and said, robotics in Washington would be very hard to do without the internship program. So I was pretty proud of our interns.
Excellent. So they've been getting accolades from a lot of different places, mm-hmm. State Robotics, UTeach Conference, and so on. typically the teacher workforce looks a lot different from the students in the classroom. In what ways is the Teach STEM program trying to remedy that?
That's a great question. I mean, it's certainly a national problem, and STEM teaching tends to have more challenges in this area. In Washington State, about 90% of our STEM teachers identify as white, and we know from Washington State demographics, our student population is much more diverse than that. So that's something that we think a lot about. We want anyone from any community that wants to be a teacher to have that opportunity, and that it makes sense that therefore our teaching workforce should be representative. For meeting that goal, it would be representative of the general demographics. So I think some of the ways that we've tried to think about how to support that goal of everyone being able to be a STEM teacher if they want to be, and therefore our demographics of teachers matching our students, is to form some of these partnerships that I talked about earlier. We, at the start of the Teach STEM program, really became connected to Wauwatosa School District, which, if people don't know, is in the town of Mattawa, which is about an hour from here down on the Columbia, and a part right in the heart of, seems like, apple and cherry growing country. And so there's a lot of families that have immigrated to that area to work in the orchards. And so the student body population is probably about 95% identify as Hispanic, and lots of multilingual learners. And so we became very connected with that school district. We do that experience that I talked about, where we go and take over the math and science departments for a day. We've done community STEM nights there. We've hosted their students here. And so we really kind of entered into a partnership and relationship. And it's not a quick fix. I don't think there's any quick fixes in education. If I'm wrong, please tell me. I've missed them. But over time, we've started to see how those relationships can change patterns. So we have our first student from Wauwatosa that has come to Central and gotten a bachelor's degree in geology, and now he's returning in the fall to student teach in Wauwatosa, and his ultimate goal is to stay in his hometown community of Wauwatosa and be a science teacher there. Right under him, we have a student in math that has the same interest. So we went from having no students from the Wauwatosa area to 2 in not many years. And so having those relationships, letting communities know about teacher certification pathways that they can take and return to the community has been very helpful in terms of recruiting students. The other piece is when we are fortunate to have students to serve, we need to think about ways that we can meet their needs. So we've become intentional about our curriculum, about language supports that we offer if we have multilingual students. We've also thought a lot about flexibility. Some of our students from these rural communities aren't able to afford to live in the dorms, or have family commitments that don't really let them live away from home during university. So we've done things about thinking about our scheduling, and I think Bruce has been really helpful in helping us think about that, that we can still offer the same content and the same rigor of content, but if we can do it in slightly more flexible ways, then we're able to meet the needs of the actual students that we have, and a wider variety of students, not just students from middle-class families that have been fortunate to be able to save for their children's education, and that child doesn't have any other obligations during college than going to college. That just doesn't meet the needs of all college-age folks. So thinking about flexibility in scheduling, thinking about linguistic supports, and then thinking about sense of belonging. We really want our students to feel like they belong, and that teaching is for them, even if they didn't maybe have a lot of teachers that speak the same home language as them, or look like them, or come from the same country as them, that we value them and welcome them, and that they have a community here. And then again, with that cohort model, they meet other teachers that might have more similar backgrounds to them, and they have that network when they go out to get their first teaching job too.
Do you have 1 or 2 success stories of students who you think may not have been as successful in a more traditional teacher education program and came to Teach STEM and have blossomed? And don't mention names, of course, but talk a little bit about their story, just so we can imagine a face and a person to the successes of Teach STEM.
Yeah, I think for a lot of our students, it's been a place where they feel like they can be successful. I don't mean this disrespectfully to other teacher ed programs, but I know thinking about my own experience, it was mainly sort of isolated classes in the evening, which was appreciated because it did give us time to either work or be in schools during the day. But it was just sort of random classes in the evening. I didn't necessarily have the same folks in each class. We didn't really have a central place to hang out like we do for Teach STEM. And so it just felt sort of disjointed. And so I think for a lot of our students, it not being disjointed is helpful. But in terms of specific stories, I can think of one student who it was during the pandemic when a lot of us were struggling, but was really feeling challenged about feeling connected and knowing what he wanted to do. And it really hurt his mental health. And he ended up actually leaving the program for a little while, and he found another job. But that other job didn't give him a sense of meaning. He was looking for that sense of impact and sense of meaning with his life. So he came back to Central and was welcomed into a new cohort. He became one of our interns, and he said through joining the cohort, kind of being a part of a cohort and joining the internship, it kind of helped him move past a lot of those challenges that had kind of reared their head during COVID. And he felt able to connect to other human beings, and he felt like he was doing something meaningful and impactful. And he kind of credits the program with really helping him have that turnaround in his own mental health, but also helping him move towards a career that he was interested in.
Earlier, you talked a little bit about funding. You mentioned some of the different ways to fund the paid internships, specific grants, and so on. Talk a little bit about how federal funding in education works, from you have an idea to you read about some funding to you apply to it, hear from it, do the work, et cetera. Just what's that storyline of a federally funded education research project?
Typically, there can be kind of two starting points. Either you have a very specific project in mind, and with those project parameters, you might look at different funding organizations and see what are called RFPs, requests for proposals. And so you would read all of those requests and see if your project might fit into one of those requests. So that's sort of one common route. Another common route is you have some funding agencies that you're familiar with. The most common one that we work with in Teach STEM is National Science Foundation. So we're often looking at the National Science Foundation, and they'll sort of announce within the STEM education realm, we have this new funding call for proposals that do X, Y, or Z. And so you might think, I would like to do the X of that X, Y, and Z. And so you start putting together a project. In truth, it's often a bit iterative. You kind of have an idea. There's a call for a funding organization like the National Science Foundation to do something like that, but it's not quite what you had in mind. So you kind of tweak your idea and then kind of go back and forth, kind of targeting that right fit between what the funding organization, such as the National Science Foundation, wants to spend money on and a project that you want to do. From there, you do some convincing writing. So you need to come up with a description of what your project is, why it's important, how it fulfills the goals of that funding organization. You have to show a budget, you have to say who's involved. And so you put together sort of this packet that describes all about your project and why it should be funded. Typically then, again, it depends on the specifics of the organization, but it'll go through some sort of review process. That's National Science Foundation, I think, has been known for being a pretty rigorous reviewer of proposals. Like publishing, it tends to be blind peer review, so they'll bring together a panel of experts to look at these proposals, and then they're sort of ranked on how much impact they would have, whether it would work, and then depending on how much funding is available, funds are then distributed to the successful proposals.
Recently, there have been some funding cuts, both actual and threats. What are one or two specific ways that Central students have been impacted by those cuts? And then what are the downstream impacts to the schools that you've said that the department works with?
Yeah, it's been challenging lately, and I will honestly say a bit sad to see these changes. In Teach STEM alone, there's been 2 large grants that the government, the government has told National Science Foundation they can no longer fund. So one of those projects was by our colleague Mark Auersland. He was collaborating with the University of Washington and some other folks from different institutions around Washington around developing a stronger computer science teaching workforce. I think Washington State has done really well about developing computer science standards from K-12. So hoping that students throughout their K-12 education will have robust computer science learning opportunities. I think we can argue that's fairly important, and especially in Washington State, we like computer science. But it's been a challenge to have folks go into computer science teaching. There's some various reasons that have been researched and uncovered. One is once you have a computer science degree, you can access jobs that have a very different pay scale than teaching. So we'll just leave it there. So a lot of folks, once they have computer science expertise, tend to shy away from education. So this grant was looking at ways to take people that have already expressed a strong interest in science, like our maybe math or chemistry or physics students, and then helping them and developing pathways where they can also become computer science teachers. So they still have opportunities to prepare and learn more about computer science, and that way more of Washington State's children can have access to a strong computer science teacher. So looking at that grant alone, it was hurtful for future teachers that might have wanted to add a computer science endorsement to either fulfill a personal interest or add to their resume, make themselves more hireable. Those opportunities are reduced. And then I'm very concerned about the downstream effect where there was a group of people actually focused on solving kind of an important problem that around not having an adequate supply of computer science teachers. Is that research is not being done and those pathways are not being developed. So Washington State children will continue to not have great access to computer science teachers.
Are some of the wealthier companies in the state noticing this and saying, we've got lots of money, we can fund this? Microsoft or Amazon, they certainly use a lot of computer scientists, and they have a lot of money. That's
true. I don't get an opportunity to have a lot of conversations with those folks. I haven't seen them jump into the arena of solving that problem as much as one might hope. I think a solution has been to look more globally for computer scientists. And so in some ways, those companies have been spared the impact of not having an adequately trained computer science workforce at home because they tend to import. That being said, we know there's some changes in the federal government's feelings about whether we want a global workforce here in the United States or not. So perversely, that might put some pressure on those companies to continue to invest locally, and maybe we'll see them step up. There have been, so not so much the tech companies, there have been some private granting foundations. Spencer Foundation is a foundation that's very interested in supporting innovative education research. And they have made available new funds to folks who've had their National Science Foundation funding cut suddenly. So another grant that unfortunately we lost at Central was focused very much on the problem that we were just talking about earlier, that our STEM teaching workforce doesn't very closely mirror the demographics of our state population and the population of children. That one was a very community-focused grant that brought together parents and teachers and community leaders from different areas that have historically had trouble accessing teacher certification pathways to study the problem together. And so that funding that would have gone to the communities to support their participation in this work is not available, and we don't have access to maybe uncovering new knowledge about different solutions or innovations that we could use to have a more diverse teacher workforce. So again, that grant unfortunately was ended, but the Spencer Foundation has been stepping up and offering to provide at least small amounts of money to get the research to kind of a good stopping point. So we're hoping that will allow us to do some data collection over the summer to at least move that grant work forward a little bit further.
Another organization that's struggling a little bit is the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education. what are the ramifications of a weaker U.S. Department of Education?
That's a great question. I think a lot of us didn't think too much about the Department of Education as long as it was operating smoothly. And so now the question becomes, what were they doing again, and what might that look like? I think, unfortunately, not having a strong Department of Education disproportionately impacts our most vulnerable populations. So a lot of education law is at the state level. States have quite a bit of autonomy over the curriculum, teacher preparation, all sorts of school-related laws and rules. And then some of that is then also dispersed down to the local level. So if you've ever seen a school board election, right, that's at the local level, people making district-level decisions about building policy and things like that. So a lot of our decision-making comes at the state level. But historically in the country, we've had the federal level of sort of oversight through the Department of Education that still grants states a lot of autonomy, but sort of put some guardrails in place. So that didn't allow states to, for instance, just not educate students with disabilities. If the states were serving all children and providing all the learning opportunities, it was fairly hands-off, but it was sort of that backstop for not allowing states to go too far off the rails in terms of who they're serving and how they're serving. And so a lot of our anti-discrimination in schools came through the Department of Education. A lot of special ed is run through the Department of Education, and so there's very specific federal mandates and safeguards for students with disabilities being able to access a free and appropriate education. All of that kind of comes through the Department of Education. So without that, it makes the national picture for education a lot murkier about who will be providing those safeguards. I think some states have mechanisms in place and it won't be a huge impact, except perhaps with funding. But other states maybe don't have those mechanisms in place to prevent discrimination against vulnerable populations. And I think those children will be unprotected.
Is Washington a state that has a lot of those protections? Yes,
Washington State has some pretty robust state legislation around not allowing discrimination and supporting educational rights for all children. I think a challenge is typically if there's a dispute between a family and the services that their child is receiving and the district or the state, there's been sort of an external arbiter that could look at discrimination law with them, and the family could appeal to the Department of Education to have that case reviewed. And so it's unclear now if there's disputes between districts in the state or families in the state, how those will get settled.
It seems that one of the poster children now, so to speak, for some of the misguided decisions the federal government is making is Harvard University. Right, Harvard University is losing hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, perhaps. Harvard University can't admit more international students. But Harvard isn't a very sympathetic story, right? People say, well, okay, Harvard loses some money. They've got an endowment of, about $50 billion, so who cares? How would you better tell that story? Because even though Harvard does have that big endowment, they still shouldn't be suffering consequences. But again, not the greatest victim, so to speak. How would you tell that story better so that people would hear of the impacts and feel more empathetic towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look to right here to Central to think about if some of the strategies being used against Harvard were applied more generally. And there's been threats to do that. Right now, one part of I focused on sort of Department of Education's interaction with K-12 schools, but I was remiss to mention the impact that has on higher education. A lot of the financial aid that students receive that allows them to go to universities or colleges is run through the Department of Education. And so if in the United States we want to tie education funding and who gets access to education funding based on sort of political beliefs or particular ideologies that must be held. I think a lot of us see that as pretty dangerous territory, not just in a singular instance, but it just doesn't allow for sort of stability. Every time the political leader changes, universities have to entirely change their ideology and curriculum. It doesn't really allow for stable running of institutions. I think it also really erodes something that's been valued, I think, throughout United States history, and that's sort of this idea of academic freedom and the freedom to pursue interesting ideas, regardless of what person is in power or what party is in power. If universities and folks are only allowed to have particular types of ideas during particular administrations, or they lose their funding, I think that's dangerous to all of us. All of that's kind of more in the philosophical realm that I think a lot of us react to and feel is a bit of a dangerous situation. In terms of thinking about the impacts that might have in people's lives, if it's decided that there's particular political views that an institution must have and that Central isn't aligned enough with those, and we lose our federal funding, that would probably mean that Central doesn't exist anymore, to be honest. I think over half of our students receive money from the federal government to help support their university education. And we work with populations that are really hardworking and a lot of times accessing university education for the first time and for the first one in their family. And there's just not another method that they have available to fund their university education. So if we lost federal funding and lost over half of our students, the institution just wouldn't exist anymore. I think Central's, no institution is perfect, but I think Central's impact on the community is pretty far-reaching, both in terms of obviously providing access to higher education for our region, but also the work that to bring this full circle, the work that our students do in the community, the internships, the extra supports they provide in schools, the jobs that Central provides to a lot of families in our community. It would be very devastating, I think, for Ellensburg and our county if Central didn't exist anymore.
So it sounds like difficult times, but difficult times don't always mean bad times. What advice would you give a 16-year-old high school student who's thinking that they're interested in becoming a teacher because they like the influence their teachers have had on them? So someone who's kind of at the beginning of their search. And then what would you tell, and maybe you have told students who are about to graduate, right? As we're recording this, graduation is occurring in about a week. What would you tell those students who are about to go out into the workforce? So 16-year-old exploring teaching, person near the end of their time, just about to go out and look for a teaching job.
Yeah, great questions. For the student interested in exploring teaching, I would say absolutely go for it. You have nothing to lose. Any profession that you go in, if you have skills and strategies to communicate information to people in a clear way that meets their learning needs, no one's going to frown upon that. So there's really no downside to at least developing some skill around teaching and learning. And whether that becomes your lifetime career or not, it's definitely worth something gaining skill in. And as you have those internship opportunities to try out the teaching profession, you can decide if that's your career or if it's something that you want to incorporate into a related career. So no downside to the 16-year-old checking that out. In terms of students that are about to graduate, I think it's important to be empathetic and sympathetic to their concerns. It is certainly during my time in education one of the more uncertain times that I've experienced. And so hearing their concerns and listening to them, I think, is important. But the narrative that I'm trying to help them think about is this is conversely, even though it seems odd, one of the best times to go into education. This is an opportunity to make a really big impact. When communities are uncertain and we're not sure what the role of education should be and how the government should support that and how we should access information and who has access to information, you have a real opportunity to work with young people to grapple with those questions. And science and math education in particular, I think, are more important than ever. I think COVID and since then has shown that we're not really great as a nation at grappling with scientific uncertainty, and understanding the scientific processes as much as we could, and how people learn science and how knowledge becomes more certain in science. And so you have a real opportunity. There's a need. Like, we have absolutely uncovered some educational needs in our nation. And so you have an opportunity to shape that conversation and maybe improve it from what we've had previously. I also talk just logistically, like, this is a good profession in Washington State. I feel proud that we compensate our teachers fairly. And so it's a living wage that you can engage in work and still raise a family. And then the other piece that I talk about is it's meaningful and impactful work. As I mentioned before, have a chance to shape the conversation in our nation about education, but you also have the chance to mentor and positively support and shape the next generation of humans that are going to be taking over in our country eventually. And so I can think of a few professions that have that far-ranging reach of impact.
You mentioned compensation twice, once in comparison to computer science graduates, and then again just saying that Washington has a fair compensation rate. And it varies some, but approximately, new teacher just with their bachelor's degree, what's their starting salary and other benefits?
I haven't looked in the last few years, but I think it's around 40,000 to 50,000. And that, one thing to realize, that is for a 9-year contract or 9-month contract. Mm-hmm. Again, thinking about logistics, if people want to start families and include kids in their family, it's nice to be on a similar schedule to your kids, and have that time off. And then also there, depending how you like to use your time, there's lots of learning opportunities, professional development in the summer. But it's a little bit different workflow during the summer too. So it has a nice sort of year-long schedule.
And also health benefits.
Yep.
And other retirement benefits and so on.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's, in some districts, it's better than that. And I know they get supplemental contracts as well. Mm-hmm. So the bottom line pay is often even more than $50,000.
Yeah, and pretty much every district has a salary schedule, so you are guaranteed to earn more over time and then earn more as you develop more teaching skills or have more education. Most districts will pay you more if you have a master's versus a bachelor's degree. So there's opportunities for financial growth in addition to sort of professional and personal growth within the field.
If someone in our audience would like to know more about Teach STEM or internships, whether they're teaching internships or the paid internships, what are 2 resources that they could go to? Websites, for example, or something that they could clearly search for information about that?
Yeah, so thinking locally, Central's website has good information. You can find information specific about Teach STEM. We also have career services that I think helps with some of those internships. So if you're thinking locally, don't forget CWU. We can help with that. In terms of teaching, at least in the state of Washington, I like the OSPI, the Office of Superintendent for Public Instruction. They have a lot of information about becoming a teacher and sort of the different pathways that are available and the different sort of internship opportunities a person has as they're learning to become a teacher.
Is there something that you'd like to share that I haven't asked you about yet?
I think if I could share one thing about why I'm in Teach STEM, or like why I am passionate about teacher education, and it relates to a bit of our previous conversation, that there are definitely some challenging situations going on in our country, not just in education, but the opportunity to hang out with young people that are interested in math and science, which I of course enjoy, but more in addition, even possibly more important, that are interested in investing in the lives of young people and want a career where they can make a difference, is just really inspiring. So I would give a shout out to our students that we get to work with, and the energy and enthusiasm and the positivity and the hard work that they're willing to put into to become the best teachers and their best selves so that they can help young kids become their best selves. So I find that really inspirational and glad that I get to spend my days with those folks.
And speaking of the students, the day before we're recording this, you were interviewed by the students on the radio station, 88.1 The Berg, your
Yes.
Music Central. Do a little cross promoting there. But what is something that they asked you that I didn't even touch upon, but you thought was a really interesting thing and you'd like to get that information out?
Yeah, they asked some of the similar ones. They wanted to know why people should go into teaching. They asked for advice, like what advice I would have for students. And I first gave them sort of the joke advice, which is check your email, because that's a running joke we have with our students. Our students being younger, I don't think don't use email as their primary source of communication. I'll just say that. But school systems, including Central, do still use that as the primary source of communication. So we have to send all their information about their internships and all of that type of thing via email. And so our biggest joke piece of advice is check your email. But that might be useful if you too are looking for an internship. Don't forget, companies might be a little slow on the technology too, so they might be emailing you. So don't forget to check your email. The serious advice I had, and I shared a little bit here already, is to just give it a try. You're not going to hurt yourself in any way or any of your career choices by learning more about education. Provides opportunities to have a profession that you may or may not have considered, and a really exciting one, and will augment any other profession. So just do it was my other piece of advice.
You didn't get sued for that?
No, because I didn't make any other references.
Okay. Well, thank you for being a part of the High Impact Practices in Teaching podcast, whether you're being interviewed, whether you're watching, listening, or just kind of daydreaming about it.
Thanks so much for having me here.